Hello everyone, my name is Monse, and the subtopic I chose to focus on was police brutality. I'm all aware that this is quite a controversial topic and that there's a lot of people with different perspectives and opinions, especially since this has been quite the occurring issue recently, and I know that a lot of people, especially the younger generation, like to put out what they think about this on social media, which I think it's great to know what everyone really thinks and that everyone should be vocal about their opinions, especially since this is such a delicate topic. With this said, I'd like to introduce you to someone we thought would give a great representation of what the majority of the younger generation believe. I'd also like to introduce you to a criminal justice teacher who also happens to be a retired cop to share with us his point of view on police brutality. So just to get started on the topic, I think it's crazy the amount of times I've scrolled through my social media and seen all these videos of people getting brutally beaten by a police officer. And it happens to be that in all these videos, it's always a Caucasian officer hurting a person of color. And it's honestly kind of ironic how the people who we would think are meant to protect us from all the bad are the ones who sometimes are against us. For the topic of police brutality, I wasn't very well informed of what has been done in order to prevent this issue. I've heard about police officers wearing cameras, but I honestly hear more about police brutality than what I hear about preventive measures. Police brutality has become just as common as hearing school, churches, movie theaters being shot up. And a common factor here is that the system doesn't hold people accountable just because of the color of their skin. We've seen it in many different cases, one well-known case being a 15-year-old boy who was pepper sprayed and brutally beaten by a Caucasian officer. In the article where they talk about this occurrence, it mentions how the 15-year-old boy reached down to pick up a cell phone that had fallen out of the pocket of the guy who was being detained by the two police officers. One of the police officers saw, and his immediate reaction was to pepper spray him and pin him to the ground. The officer also claims that the young man, and I quote, took an aggressive stance, and so the cop proceeded to punch him with a closed fist on the right side of his head. After this, the young man had to report himself to court, and not only was he charged with assault, but he was charged with resisting arrest and trespassing, all for picking up a cell phone. And I think this shouldn't be such an issue, and that there needs to be a way to end all of this injustice. The first interview that we will be hearing is the interview I did with my older sister, Fernanda, and she brought up really good points, and I just want you guys to go ahead and listen to what she had to say. So I'm here with Fernanda, and she is going to give us her perspective on police brutality. She is a 19-year-old college student, so this should be interesting. Hello, Fed.
Hello.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. Okay. With the basic question, what is your perspective on police brutality?
Police brutality, I think, has been an issue that, gets talked about but doesn't really there's not much that gets done revolving around it. There's not very many, well, from what I've seen at least, there hasn't been ways to prevent it. There hasn't been ways or I don't really see people being held accountable for their actions when they're clearly in the wrong.
Okay. I know one person can't solve this such a big issue, but what do you think is one step that we could take to kind of start solving it, or
raising awareness?
Yeah.
I'm not too sure. I feel like there's already been marches, there's been protests, people have been vocal about there needing to be a change. I think we're at a point where we need change to happen. We need people to be held accountable. We need to hold authority figures accountable for their actions, because the more police officers get away with doing things that aren't right, the more they're going to happen. An example would be one kid hitting another. If they don't have a consequence and they see they get away with it, more likely than not, they're going to repeat that action because there are no consequences, so they think it's okay. It's the same thing. Such a basic thing, so I don't know. It just really comes down to just people not being held accountable.
Okay. Okay, and why do you think these police officers aren't being held accountable for their actions?
Well, obviously this isn't every case, but majority of the cases, it's usually a Caucasian officer, male or female, shooting or just using an excessive amount of force that can potentially be lethal against a Black person or a person of color. Then whenever these situations end up being taken to court, some don't even make it to court. The police officers let out on bail. They end up being released. I'm not too familiar with the legal system, but because of the privilege that they have of being a white person and shooting a person of color or a Black person who can easily be painted as this as a criminal or as a person that inflicts fear, and the police officer ends up being excused with being scared or fearing for their life or fearing for others. They end up being left off the hook. So I think really it just comes down to white privilege.
Yeah, and we saw it. There is a case where a young man was actually beat by an officer, and the officer claims that, I quote, took an aggressive stance. And the kid wasn't doing anything wrong, but he ended up getting charged. He got charged multiple things. So it's just, like you said, it always comes down to...
Speaking on the topic, I don't know if you remember, but a couple of years back, there was a boy, I think around 13, 14 years old. His name was Andy Lopez. Somewhere near Santa Rosa County, somewhere in that area, he was holding a fake or a replica of a gun, and a police officer shot him. And I don't know if you remember all of the protests. I remember when it all happened, I don't think the cop was fired. I think he was sent home and he was on paid leave. Oh. It is, if I'm remembering correctly, and just to think about it, it's just
crazy.
It's infuriating because you've got school shooters. I don't know who was it? There's been so many, and it's hard to keep track, and it's sad that you can't keep track. Was it Sandy Hook, the first one at the school in Florida, when they escorted out the shooter and put a life vest on him? So because they were in fear of his life, they didn't want someone to kill him on the way.
Hurt him,
it was a guy.
It's crazy, and they always try to excuse the person who does something harmful
with mental health issues, mental illness, and yes, these are issues that need to be addressed. But if a person of color or Black person is held accountable, why can't a Caucasian be held accountable?
Yep.
I know they're completely different topics,
but it all
not totally unrelated, but don't necessarily.
But it all comes down to
But it
one
comes
thing.
down to white privilege. Yeah, that's what it is.
Another question is, as a person of color, do you respect and trust a police officer or an authority figure?
I think, you can't just stereotype and assume that every cop is a bad cop, that every authority figure isn't a good person, because I wouldn't like to be stereotyped. I know I am stereotyped and I don't like that. So it's not that I don't trust them, but I feel like I do tend to have my guard up, but I am not one to disrespect a cop or an authority figure just simply because of the job or the profession that they're in. It's kind of like innocent until proven guilty. I'm not going to assume you're a bad person until you show me you're a bad person. But I feel I've been in situations where, you need to speak to an authority figure, or it's my mom who needs to speak to an authority figure. And let me backtrack a little bit. So it's obvious that I'm a person of color, but sometimes in the way I talk, it's not very obvious. Like many of my family members, I don't have an accent because I've grown up here, so I know how to speak English fairly well. But as for my mom or other family members, they can speak English. They you can understand them, but it's obvious that
it's not their first language.
Yeah, it's not their native language. It's not their first language. That this isn't their country, and people tend to talk down, or they tend to undermine you, or they just don't have the same respect for me as they do for my mom, and I notice it. So maybe it's not just authority figures, but I feel like with the history that authority figures have, I do have the need to want to protect my mom or close family members in the same situation as my mom. So to briefly answer your question, I do respect them. Maybe I'm not so trustworthy, but I can't assume every cop is a bad cop. So I think innocent until proven guilty. You're a good person until you show me you're not.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for letting me interview you. I love everything you talked about.
Thank you.
It was really good. You hit a lot of good points, and well, thank you very much.
Thank you for listening.
Like we both mentioned, police officers will always have an excuse for their actions, and their excuse is always taken into consideration. Although we feel as if no action is being taken to solve such an issue, there is a bill that is trying to be passed, and it's the Bill H.R. 2927, Preventing Tragedies Between Police and Communities Act of 2019. What the bill is trying to state is that police officers should be trained on how to act adequately in a situation where they may need to get physical with a person. And I think that we could all agree that this bill would be a big step into resolving such an issue.